This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety. Good morning, Kelly, and good morning, Patrick Van Horne. This has been a long-awaited podcast for sure.
Long anticipated, right?
I feel like I know Patrick very well because I've heard his name, I think, probably
72 times.
At least 48 times from Kelly.
Well, that's because I have to give him credit.
Yeah, I've also heard Left a Bang at least twice as much as that. So
I appreciate that. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you on here. It's gonna be good. I'll just have Patrick, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us what you're all about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And like I said, I'm really happy to be joining you two today. For the last 20 years, I've been working with organizations in different capacities, preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. My career started out not long after 9/11. I spent a few years in the Marine Corps as an infantry officer, and then been working with public, private, and sector organizations and nonprofits ever since, focused more on disaster management as well. So I think if I had to guess, though, to your point, if I had to guess a while I was asked to join you two today, it was probably about the book Left a Bang, which I had the chance to co-author about a decade ago now.
Left a Bang. Have we talked about that enough yet, Ethan?
Oh, man. If it wasn't already a thing, it probably would have been the name of our podcast.
It wasn't, right? Yeah. So, yeah, we've talked about it extensively, and that's why this was such an anticipated podcast. And so I spent a lot of my time developing my philosophies and stuff, really looking towards the military community to see how they're solving their problems, because when they solve their problems, that helps me solve mine, having spent so many years in law enforcement and emergency management and so forth. Those two groups always seem to be working in crisis kind of modes and stuff, and what we can do to prevent things and what we can do to mitigate things and so forth. And how do we respond once it really gets into a crisis if we fail at the prevention and mitigation. And so that's what we really want to talk about today, is that translation from the military and why this translates so well to school safety, emergency management, and such. So, Patrick, give us a little bit about what Left a Bang really is.
Yeah, and that context is great in terms of the conversation. And when Jason Riley, who's my co-author, and I sat down to write the book, Left a Bang, it was really to do that exact thing. The Marine Corps in 2007 had created this program designed to teach Marines and soldiers and sailors, how do you recognize these pre-event indicators to violence so that we're not just reacting to the attacks that we were experiencing in Iraq and Afghanistan, but to give us the ability to get ahead of them and to be proactive and to regain the initiative. The challenge was, at the time, we could only train a very small number of Marines before they deployed. And when we sat down to write the book, it was to take these lessons and this case study the Marine Corps had created that was getting incredible feedback from deploying Marines and make sure that it became available to anyone who wanted to learn how to do this. And, the Marine Corps' program, at its core, what it did was help individuals make faster decisions in relation to potential threats. It taught them how to establish a baseline for behavior for any place you might go in the world. And once you know how to establish that baseline, that person with the violent intent, that person whose behavior just stands out from that baseline can attract your attention, and you can do it in a very informed way. So it just provides those people on the ground, whether it's the military or the here at home school setting, just the opportunity to intervene by just having a little bit more informed awareness and the confidence to do something about it once you recognize that, hey, there's just something different, about this person around us today.
Right. And, the beauty of it is that it's essentially universal, and it has to be, right? And it's based upon physiological effects on the human comfort and hierarchy of dominance and so forth, and things that are, for the most part, outside of the cultural norms within a society, right? So these are things that are directly transferable to almost every situation. Obviously, I'm not going to say every situation, but pretty close to it, because it is based upon the natural human response. We've talked extensively about the human response to crisis, but this is the human response before crisis. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we have to emphasize is left of bang being it's happened. Something's happening right now. We're trying to address everything where we all want to be is in that preventative state, or at least give ourselves the best opportunity at survival.
Absolutely. And, and when we're talking about violence specifically, the reason we look at prevention for violence is the consequences of that are so extreme. People are either killed or they are hurt for the rest of their lives, or struggle to recover if they do survive those events. There are other risks that we simply don't care about preventing. If you were to look at, getting burned by your cup of coffee or a paper cut or something like that, it's not worth the effort to prevent that. You will be fine at the end of the day. And the reason we're looking, and so the effort to prevent it would be unreasonable and probably would never be done. But when we're talking about prevention, we're talking about these things where just the consequences are so extreme that we want to stop it. And then for a lot of the other incidents, whether we can't prevent it or due to organizational dynamics, maybe they weren't prevented, or they're not worth preventing. Maybe it's finding a way to position ourselves to be successful and to grow, when that incident does occur. And so really being left to bang by having that advanced warning that, hey, this event is coming, either A, use that opportunity to prevent, or be ready and positioned to grow and succeed once it does occur.
So let me ask you this. I don't think we got into this so much in previous conversations, but when we start talking about the prevention and mitigation, what does that look like to you? When you identify somebody who's showing signs, what's that intervention? What's that identification look like? And what are the sort of the options there?
Yeah, I think there's, when you think about this, right? If you look at someone and you see a weapon, let's say, and you are 100% certain this person has the weapon and the potential to do harm, decision making in these situations is relatively straightforward, depending on your role, whether it's calling 911 or doing something to stop that attack or working to get people out of the area to protect them. When it's clear that, hey, there's something going on, I find that people make decisions pretty confidently and pretty quickly and work to protect themselves and others. When there's behaviors, though, or there's things that you're seeing in your environment that you're not clear about, those are sometimes harder decisions to make, but they still should warrant maybe some sort of action. And one of the things we talk about in the book and in our courses is if you're looking at a person whose behavior has attracted your attention, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to inflict harm or they're going to commit some sort of attack. It just means that their behavior is different than everyone else. But now you can start to focus on them. And that could include maybe observing them a little bit longer. Maybe that goes up or drives and leads you to go up and have a conversation, especially in a school setting with that child or with that person who's visiting the school, just to try to figure out, maybe we're seeing these uncomfortable behaviors. Why are they uncomfortable? And there's both reasonable and rational, as well as illegitimate reasons a person could be displaying some of these behaviors. But once you see that indicator, that cue that, hey, there's something going on here, going up to either gather more information and maybe starting maybe some of your back end processes, if we should start to alert people or notify, leadership in the school or something like that whenever we see these, to start to prompt that action before something bad does happen.
Yeah, so this is where the hair on the back of your neck starts to react or starts to, get noticed. And taking that next step is the critical. You notice it, now we have to do something about it. We have to inform somebody, we have to investigate, we have to do something. But I want to go back just a little bit into something you said about this clearly an issue, clearly not an issue, and then that gray area. I know Ethan and I have talked about this quite a bit, is when we look at the school setting where people aren't really informed in identifying these behaviors and so forth, then that leads us to be into it is either clearly happening or it's not. And they're not playing in that gray area. So that kind of leads us into that response area, and we're in a reactive response society because people, they're waiting for something to clearly happen that, I have to do this now. Whether it's an alert, whether it's shots being fired, whether it's a tornado ripping down your building, whatever it is, right? But if we're going to play in the prevention and mitigation space, we have to play in that gray area, right? We have to understand that gray area.
And I think there's, I think there's two things that come to mind as you say that. And first, when we wrote Left to Bang, this was written for the individual Marine soldier sailor on the ground overseas, because we were talking about attacks. That person on the front lines was the person not only closest to the threat, but who was most at risk. And so teaching an individual, how do you observe people around you? How do you put that behavior into context? How do you make a decision and ultimately implement your plan or execute those decisions that you've made? It was the individual that needed to execute that cycle more quickly than our adversaries could. And to a degree in schools today, that is still an absolute need for the people who are observing and interacting with others. But there's also organizational decision-making that I think needs to be considered here as well, where you have one person who is recognizing a threat or hazard, who is sharing that information with a different group, maybe who's making the decision, and which is a different group entirely from the people implementing it. And when you talk about living in that gray area, or where it's not clear yes or no, organizational decision-making historically breaks down or goes very slowly because the person observing the behavior, observing the situation, might not be able to articulate it in a way where that decision maker goes, yeah, there is something that we need to do right now. More often than not, it's that decision-making group who sees that uncertainty or isn't clear about maybe the threat that person is posing or what to do about it. And oftentimes that's where you see things stall. And so when we're talking about living in that gray area, one, I think we need to address and talk about maybe organizational decision making and how can we make that loop fast enough where leaders can be confident. But also then thinking about how are we teaching those people who are interacting with the public not only what to be observing, but how to communicate and articulate that back to the decision makers in a way that says, yes, I'm not just being crazy. No, I'm not just seeing things. There is something here that warrants some sort of action. And so there's also that communication piece from the person who's observing the threat back to those decision makers as well. And that leads into the second point that I'll make is when you're thinking about, well, how do you live in this gray area? You have to prompt people to be aware of their surroundings and to begin looking for those indicators. And not too long after I got out of the military, one of my first people that I taught was a school district. And I remember this conversation that I had with a principal after this course, who we went through everything that I was teaching. And he talked about how these principles apply not just to threat recognition, but to a teacher who's trying to understand if their methods and their approaches and their lessons are resonating with their students. And we repackaged the entire course in the way that we taught it to teach teachers how do you simply use these behaviors and these observations to figure out if you're connecting with your students, or if there's some students who are struggling, or if there's some students who are bored. But by framing it into the things that they cared about, they started to pick up these behaviors and those examples much more quickly. And then from there, we can just tie it in at the end of the course. Oh, by the way, these same behaviors apply to recognizing threats and seeing people who don't maybe belong in your school, or seeing people who warrant a little bit of attention. And so I think the other side of that's teaching this in a way that resonates and connects with those people who are out there interacting with the public and people.
Great. Ethan, you have anything?
So basically, I would ask I guess it's a question for Kelly. Do you think that teachers or staff are like trained to like do that, to look for those anomalies in behavior and have the ability to report them to the principal or anything like that? Or
the answer to that is yes and no. What really happens is, and Patrick touched on this right at the end of what he just said, and that is some of the behaviors are the same. Remember, we've talked about, it's been a couple years now, one of my aha moments was the point at which I made the connection between academic failure and threat of violence potential. I never really explored that side because I've always worked on threat management, threat identification, threat mitigation, intervention, that type of stuff, right? So I've never really looked at the academic side because that was somebody else's silo. I'm specifically using that because that's what happened with me is this silo was over there and it wasn't mine. I'm not going to explore it. I'm not going to go inside of it. That's academic. That's not Kelly. And then all of a sudden, shortly after I started working for Crisis Go, we got a request for a proposal, RFP, to create a matrix, a point system for identifying behaviors for those at risk for academic failure and scoring those so that they had a better idea. They would just essentially put in the behaviors and it would say, oh, you have a huge problem or you need to do this. These are the solutions to that, which to me is a whole nother podcast on you need to learn how to make your own decisions. In reviewing that RFP, I looked at, and they were almost identical. The behaviors that I associate with threat management and the behaviors for risk of academic failure. And when you start thinking about that, then yes, they're likely trained to start identifying that. That's their ballywhack or whatever you want to call that, right? So that's their expertise. So they want to focus on that. Now, all we have to do is do the same thing that I did and connect the two. And then you ask this one final question. If you identify somebody who's at risk for academic failure, then you also have to ask yourselves, do they pose a risk for violence? If they run parallel, that means that even if they're showing almost zero or no propensity towards violence, that it's a very short detour to violence because they're already exhibiting these behaviors. They might not have connected it yet. So the answer is yes and no, but we also have to understand the environment. We have these teachers who are arguably overworked, stressed, and they have 30 problems at minimum. They have 30 problems that walk into their classroom every day. And sometimes the best thing to do is treat it as a disciplinary issue. And I'm going to move my problem and make it somebody else's problem and not really address the behavior. Right. So how many kids are being sent to the principal's office or to the library or somewhere else and so forth. So I hope that answered your question, Ethan, because we're not really addressing the issue. Right.
Yep.
If I could follow on to that too, Kelly, I think, especially as we talk about behavior, this topic can be very broad and cover a lot of different, ideas and concepts that go into it. And I think, one of the things that I think you're talking about a little bit as well, and what separates that from what the behaviors we talk about in Left to Bang are, in the behaviors we're talking about in the book, are once that person has made the decision to commit an act of violence. And it's the behaviors that say, yes, this person is moving down this pathway, but they have made the decision, and that's what's causing their behaviors to stand out. The other side, though, on what is leading people to make that decision, what's maybe driving them into that, that's a very tough field, and I'm always very impressed by the the threat assessment professionals who are working on that topic. But one other piece, Ethan, on your question of can teachers do it? My answer is they do it already on the behaviors. And I recognize that every school and every district and every community is a little bit different, but I watch my kids go into elementary school and there's always someone right there at the door, looking at every kid coming through, seeing if they're sad, seeing if they're upset, seeing if they're happy, saying hi to everyone. And their decisions might be about, is this person just having an okay, or is this child having an okay day? or not, but they're making the same observations that, we talk about in the book that can just let you know, hey, there's something, and they're making of this child, this student is a little bit different, than whatever. Maybe I should just have a conversation, see if they're doing okay, see if everything's okay at home. And so sometimes I think, that they're very able to do it. They're probably doing it already, whether they're using the terminology or using the process or not as well.
I'll add to that, and I totally agree with that, is not only are they already doing it, they have an advantage over the soldier in the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And that's because the people they're assessing every day are the same people. So their baselines are established pretty quickly. They understand the differences. They understand, although some of them might be subtle. You walk in, and I was doing this, somebody asked early on when I was doing threat assessments at the school level, when I was the safety director, they said, Kelly, how did you learn how to do these? I said, I do these every day as law enforcement. You do a threat assessment, a quick assessment on everyone you come into contact. We've talked about this before, Ethan, where I am looking at everyone who comes into my path, and I am trying to say, ooh, that's not right. Or I sometimes, if I need to refresh my skills, I will say, why isn't that guy a threat? Right. And I'll start working through that. But I would do that every day. But when you're in the school system, they look at these kids every day. And this is one of the problems that we have I know this is taboo to say this, but I'm going to.
Can't wait. Yeah.
Right. Is we identify kids as troublemakers, disruptors, outcasts, but we don't ever make an effort to find out why. We just move them through, keep moving them through. And it's those people that we have to understand home life. We have to understand their previous school experience. Were they bullied? Were they whatever, right? Left out of the social circles, isolated, however you want to work through those. Looking at, from the teacher's perspective, these are kids that need, and I don't mean this derogatorily, they need special attention. We need to look at them. I remember, again, when I was back at the school districts, whenever there was a change in schools, our district, when you went from elementary school to middle school to high school, is primarily where this occurred. But whenever there was a change of schools, the teachers, the administrators from the different schools would come in and say, okay, who's our problem children? What problems am I going to have next year? And so if you were to ask them, they would say this was done for the purpose of trying to help this child. But with the numbers, that's not necessarily the case, right? Oh, this kid's a problem kid. Okay, why is he still a problem kid? Yeah. Why didn't we correct that issue when you had them? Those are some of the conversations, but those are also some of the things that we need to work on.
So let's talk about, I don't think you guys have really hit on it yet in this one. Let's talk about leadership. What is the role of school administrators and, leaders that are in the school? What's their role in identifying behaviors?
To me, it's really comes down to two things. First, it's, as we talk about kind of going back, that decision making on the fringes and that gray area where it's not completely clear, yes, this is a bad situation, or no, it's not. It's defining what criteria that leader needs to make a decision, defining that, go, no go criteria, open, close, school criteria, and being very clear on what that is. And that is not a responsibility, in my opinion, that a leader or an executive can delegate down to people. Their staff can develop the plans and the contingencies for, if we have this bad weather, this is what we'll do. If we see this bullying, or if we see this behavioral incident, this is what we're going to do. But defining that criteria has to be a responsibility of the person who is making a decision. And more often than not, in my experience, I guess, I don't want to say more often than not, but in my experience, those criteria are very vague, or they're abstract, or it's not clear what is it going to look like when I see this? And as a result, it really it hinders progress, or it hinders preparation, because people don't really know what that decision maker is going to do. And so the first thing I would say is define whatever criteria and define those decisions that you make as explicitly as you can. And from there, then you can empower your team or your staff to build out, those watch points, and those action points, and those contingency plans. Then the second thing, in my opinion, that leaders should be doing, it's developing the capabilities that they need when these things occur. And they don't have to be the one driving it or doing all the work, but they need to be the one making sure that, whether it's planning or information sharing, or, okay, we get a call from a community member, comes into this person, but we need to take action. How does that process look? Who's communicating with who, and kind of what is that response, and making sure that those different response capabilities that they need are just being continually developed. And from there, I think then schools just naturally, or any organization really naturally, develops then more of that culture of preparedness, because they're seeing those little steps taken day in and day out. And you're also providing your team the chance to practice on smaller scale things that allow them to figure out, hey, this process doesn't work. Or if I'm waiting for this person to notify me, but this person's never in their office, or they're not by their phone, or they don't have a radio, maybe we shouldn't be waiting on that person to initiate the sequence. And by providing those little smaller incidents, people just, it's like a football practice or any other sports practice. You just get a little bit, better, more finely tuned, just by doing it day in and day out. And so from a leadership perspective, I think those would be the two things I'd go for. Define your criteria, and then make sure your teams are building those capabilities that your organization needs.
So for me to add on to that, it's the responsibility of the leader to create an environment and develop a culture where they want to do it, right? So I use the definition of leadership is having influence on others so that they want to do something, or they do something because they want to do it, not because you told them that they have to do it. And that goes a long way to developing that culture where they want to really make a difference. They want to identify this. They want to get involved. We're not talking about preventing a threat of violence, mitigating a threat of violence. What we're really talking about is the overall success of every student. And if we start looking at early intervention at the appropriate level, stop the bullying, and at all levels, because we've talked about this as well, right? That there are teachers who bully. You're not going to make anything of yourself. If you don't stop, this is going to happen to you, all these things. Let's work through that. Let's create that positive environment. Let's create these. Do I think there needs to be negative consequences? Of course. But the more we can stay in the positive, the better off we are, But it's wanting to make everyone successful. If we make everyone successful, then we succeed at all this other stuff, if that makes sense, right? And sometimes we can't leave it up to the kid to define what success is. Sometimes we have to, right? But I've told you about this 10-year-old kid at the school who was in the district, who was identified as the most violent kid in the entire district, 10 years old. His goal and his definition of success was he wanted at some point in his life, to become the leader of the Mexican mafia. That's how he defines success. We can't let him go down that path. It's working through that and bringing that all together. And that is the leadership's responsibility, to define that, to make sure that their staff understands, gives them the tools to respond, to intervene. And when somebody just starts shipping kids down to the office because they're disciplinary problems, then we need to figure that out. The leadership needs to go and say, what's going on? Why can't you handle this child? I know I'm going to get some backlash on that because I have 29 other kids I have to deal with. Okay, let's figure this out. Let's get a plan and let's actually figure this out.
Kelly, I appreciate you bringing this up, because one of the things I missed in my answer was you just tied it back to the mission and the purpose of the school initially. And whenever these, whether it's emergency preparedness or other kind of threat readiness programs that you see, when they're disconnected from the mission, they always, or not, I don't say they always fail, but they often fail because it's it's thought of as an expense. It's thought of as something extra. It's thought of something as that detracts from the mission. But when you tie all these back in, it's about making sure those kids can succeed in your environment that you're creating. And so tying it back into the reason we have schools, I appreciate that as well. It's a really important piece.
Left to Bang is not just about behaviors. It is also all of the procedural things that need to happen to allow our people to have those tools. Give me the number one and number two excuses why we don't do something in schools, Ethan.
Time and money.
Time and money. Who's responsible for that, right? Time and money. Principals, school boards, superintendents, leadership. From a Kelly perspective, 100% my opinion, that's where we're failing. We're not budgeting the time. We're not budgeting money for these training that's necessary to do this. This is one of the primary reasons we are 25 years past Columbine and we're still here. We're still doing this. The questions are our schools safer? We're recording this on the 17th of December. On the 16th, we had a shooting in Wisconsin. It ain't going away, right? And everyone seems to be surprised that this is still happening. If I call some district, almost any district, say, in school safety, what's your biggest concerns? Money, time. It's a leadership issue.
Something I've been working on a lot, probably more with clients than almost any other topic over the last 6 months or so. It's spent a lot of time talking about how do you learn how to learn from others, right? And so locally, in the concept of disasters, locally disasters are relatively rare. Nationally, they occur pretty regularly. Similar with school shootings. Hopefully, you have none. Most for many schools, you might have one, but for a lot of other schools, hopefully it's never. But how do you take these lessons learned from an incident that occurred on the other side of the country in a different district with different policies, different procedures, different readiness, and extract from that the things that you need to use to stress test your own plans and stress test your own readiness to make sure that you are putting in that time. And again, kind of going back to your question on leadership, I think that's a piece of making sure you're learning from others and then using it to improve your own readiness. And if it's a question of time or money, this can at least inform and guide maybe some of those investments in both time and money to at least make sure that you're focused on those things that will move the needle, or that we're exposed in a real life situation that maybe you hadn't considered because it hadn't happened in your district just yet.
Yeah, and we talk about it pretty frequently. What if, right? What if? What's the worst that could? Those types of questions. And
tabletops.
I'm a huge proponent of that. Right? Is taking those exact circumstances, regardless of their procedures, their resources, their whatever, but take the circumstances, time of day, the attacker, what they did pre-event, what we know about it, and say, what would happen if that happened here today? What do we learn from that? And one of the things I will implore people who are looking at doing that, first of all, probably the best way to really up your safety IQ is through after action reviews of things that you are doing and what other people are doing. But understand whoever is actually reviewing those is doing it from the perspective of that school under those circumstances and so forth, right? And sometimes the conclusions that are made based upon those specific circumstances and not how they relate to you and your circumstances. And look at these as what they are, a tool. Take those circumstances, look at those disasters, whether they're threats of violence, weather situations, hot, cold, snow, blizzard, whatever, hazardous material stuff. I guess it's close to a couple years now. You had the train derail with all the toxic chemicals in Ohio, and that shut down a community. What happened if you're next to a railroad? What would happen if that happened to you? What would happen if you had a crash in front of your school with a tanker truck, right? And then work through those. But make sure that you work through those to how they would impact you and how you would respond. What would you need to respond? And I think you touched on it just a little bit in talking about the gaining experience by looking at these, because what that does is allow you to put those experiences in the back of your head and make those decisions quicker, reduce that reactionary gap. And it allows us to play in that gray area because these are things that we've seen before. When we process things, we compartmentalize things. When we're looking at making decisions and so forth, we have to look at and we take from previous experiences. And the more experiences we have, the faster we can process that. And we go, nope, those were gunshots. How do you know? Because I've heard those before. I've been to the range. I know what it sounds like when I'm shooting inside a building in an indoor range. I know what that sound is. So I know. And even if it's not, I ask, what's the worst that could happen? If I believe they're similar to gunshots and I take protective actions and they turn out to be a backfire of a car out in the parking lot or something, okay, oh well, right? We just did a drill, unplanned drill. Now, if they are actually, then we've taken the appropriate action, right?
I will say, though, Kelly, that is not an excuse to do the unannounced active threat drill in a school with blanks and simunitions and other things, which somehow we still continue to see today, which causes
that's silly
potentially more problems.
That's absolutely silly.
Yeah.
Now, here's what I am against. The state of California says you can't use simulated weapons in a drill, period. End of story. Can't do it. I don't believe if you're going to reduce fatalities and injuries, they have to recognize the sound of gunfire. So if you brought in, let's say, a law enforcement team or something, and you said, okay, we're doing this completely controlled. These are all blanks. These are all just to give you the idea of what it sounds like and teach that. I don't have any problems with that. Zero problems with that. Educate them first. Tell them what's going on. Prepare them for that so that they get that experience. Don't just do it and, oh, we're going to have a drill sometime this month and then just show up and start doing that's silliness.
That would be a wrong thing to do in certain states.
Yeah, it's just silly.
Like mine.
Silly.
That would be horrible.
Yeah. But
it happens all the time.
Oh, man.
It does, and it's silly. But that being said, there are appropriate uses for it, i.e. a full drill where you have law enforcement responding. So you understand as a teacher, as a principal, what it is they're going to do when they respond, right? So I think there's appropriateness to it, and outlawing it is just silly to me. I mean, I don't mind the outlawing of unannounced full drills. Totally. There's too much. There's so many things that can go wrong.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We could talk a whole lot about those and swatting incidences and those types of things. That there are so many things that have gone wrong and can go wrong with those. In fact, I'll give you this. My boys will hate me for this. We were doing active shooter training at a large industrial complex, and two of our training guys were screwing around and somebody got shot. So in a controlled environment, somebody forgot to clear the weapon.
Oh my gosh.
And so there's so many things that can go wrong. That's why it has to be controlled. It has to be planned. It has to be part of the curriculum. And there has to be so many safeguards so that nobody gets hurt. We were just lucky there wasn't a fatality.
One of my question I have, I guess, I don't know if you've really totally covered this. Like, let's say I'm a teacher. I'm in a school where I feel like I don't have the time, or I don't have, the funding to do some type of specific training on like behavioral assessment or something like that. How can I integrate practicing that like in my daily routine that I'm already doing?
There's a ton of free resources that are out there, from websites, blog posts, relatively inexpensive online courses. And then after that, it's just a matter of practicing. I mean, threat management to me, outside of those really extreme events, it comes down to just recognizing what's happening around you and building in the muscle memory of doing something about it. I see a child who's uncomfortable or upset today. I'm not going to make an assumption. I know why they're acting that way or behaving that way, but I'm going to have a conversation to figure out, are you nervous because you didn't have a chance to, study for your test or something happened at home? Or are you nervous and uncomfortable because you have a weapon in your backpack? I'm not going to make an assumption either way, but I'm going to see behavior that doesn't make sense. I'm just going to build that habit of, now I'm going to ask, I'm going to observe, I'm going to figure out why, they're doing it without jumping to a conclusion that is probably not informed by, that person's life and their experiences and what's driving them to act that way. But it requires a really minimal amount of time and effort, just practice of see something and do something about it. And it doesn't have to be in a intrusive way. It doesn't mean go tackle them to the ground because you saw this behavior. It's start with a conversation.
Sure.
Yeah.
So do you want me to say something controversial, Ethan?
I mean, sure. I'm all about it. As long as it'll get Patrick kicked off, that's fine.
Oh, he signed the waiver.
He's like, wait, what?
You go, what waiver?
Oh, man.
I will tell you this. There's a lot of discussion going around about formal education versus informal education. And in my experience, it is those people who practice the art of learning. They're lifelong learners. I've learned so much. I didn't know a lot of what I'm talking about today a few months ago. Something came in, a book that I've been saying, let's try to start preventing this. And then somebody says, hey, have you ever read this book? No. Bam. You read the book and things start clicking. You can start putting things together. Behaviors. I didn't look at academic risk. And then all of a sudden something clicked. Pathways. We have the pathway to violence. Why don't we have the pathway to every other threat? If this is what we're going to teach and the framework in which we're going to teach, why don't we do that? So generally speaking, if the formal education says, read this book, look here, do this, test this, it allows us to put in the minimal effort required to actually learn that subject. One of the reasons that law school is so much more difficult than every other academic environment is because they don't teach you. They ask a question. They give you some resources and say, read them. And then you have to figure out how they apply. You have to make an argument one way or the other or both ways. And then you're scared out of your wits that you're going to go back into the class and the professor, who's a 30-year lawyer, is going to sit there and say, stand up, answer these questions. You have to understand from all of those different perspectives. Most of the informal education that we have just takes a little effort. Just take one thing and start putting it in, like Patrick said, put it into your routine, whatever that is. Just ask yourself a question. Why is little Johnny acting that way? Hey, Johnny, what are you doing? Come here. Let's talk. You might have a C-clamp on the back of his neck in case he starts fighting with you, but you might want to start talking to him and say, what's going on, dude? What is it that you're missing here? What am I missing? And start working through that and making that connection. The internet is absolutely crazy with the amount of information. Sure, some of it's not great, but it's there. I can ask any question I want and I'll get an answer to it. And then if I don't like that answer, I can start researching it. It's effort. And effort, generally speaking, takes how many dollars?
$0.
$0.
So we've already eliminated one of the barriers.
Right? Time costs money because I have to pay somebody to do that, and they expect to be paid for that. Time costs money. Effort does not. Effort is from you to the cause, whatever that is. Effort is sometimes costs somebody something, maybe, right? In the trades or what have you. But still, running through drills costs zero money because you're already paying them to be there. Training them on emergency stuff at a staff meeting? $0. Working through an exercise on a tabletop? $0. First of all, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. I want to say, in conclusion, we all want to play in this preventative mitigation phase. We all want to play there. Unfortunately for us, that's where it takes the most effort, right? Mm-hmm. Because we have to work through the problems. We have to be critical thinkers. We have to be problem solvers. We have to be articulate that we have a problem and we need help. We need all of those things. So it's where we want to be. Dedicate yourselves to be there, right? Nobody wants to be in this response mode. I will say, in acknowledgement of the shooting in Wisconsin yesterday, one thing that was absolute truth. The chief of police said everyone in that building was a victim, and they will be victims forever. They will always be identified as being in that building during that incident. They will have emotional trauma. They will have issues. Some will handle it better than others, obviously. But we see it with Columbine, the students that were there. So if you want a rally cry or motivation, we talked a little bit about this in previous incidences. We aren't successful unless we have 0 injuries, 0 fatalities, 0 victims. We're not successful. That's a high bar to reach, and it's going to be very difficult to do such. But if we want to, we cannot continue to play in the reaction and the response phase of life. We just can't afford to do that. I hope that helps people say, all right, let's get there. Let's figure this out. But I hope it motivates them, because we cannot continue to play in this reactive response side. Your response should be in response to something that you can prevent or mitigate. That's your response, not after something happened, not after the first shots were fired, not when there is because we've had fatalities with weapons other than firearms.
And that's what motivated and drove the Marine Corps to develop their program. It was all, up until this point, it was all just, how do you react? How do you armor up to try to protect yourself, survive that initial salvo, and then respond, react decisively. And it only got to the point where the cost of that was so high that there was the need to identify new ways. And when the Marine Corps did it, there wasn't a lot in terms of preventative approaches that were out there. It was the experts that they brought together to design this program that changed that. And now, 18 years after that course was created, 10 years after the book was written. And sometimes people ask, like, hey, the title Left to Bang gets used in all these different contexts. Preventative approaches are out there. And I think it's amazing. Like, this is what's needed to actually get to this goal, Kelly, that you talk about. The goal is 0, period, especially in schools. And we're not there yet. We have a lot of work to do as an industry and as a society and as school districts and as communities. But there are ways, and there's a lot of people who are trying to find innovative approaches using people and technology and equipment and all the different resources that we have available. And I think we can get there, but not until we make that commitment that the goal is 0, period.
Yeah, absolutely. And coincidentally, I'm a member of an organization called Zero Now for that purpose, right? It also goes to show you that money alone and things alone can't prevent a bad outcome. When you talk about the military, look at all the armor they had, all of the vehicles, all of the weaponry, all of these things that they had, and they were still losing.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.